Hey guys, tonight we're doing something slow, quiet, and a little bit grim in a very ancient way. So lower the lights, set the phone down somewhere safe, and let the world gently blur at the edges. Tonight we begin with Sparta. Not the movie Sparta, not the yelling, slow motion, oil covered fantasy version. The real Sparta. The one that somehow decided comfort was suspicious and joy was optional. Sparta was a Greek city-state that made one core decision early on. War would not be something they did occasionally. It would be the entire point. Everything else would simply exist to support it. No poetry competitions, no philosophers arguing in the street, no dramatic plays about feelings. Athens handled that. Sparta handled standing in lines and not flinching. The Spartans believed society worked best when everyone knew their role and stayed in it quietly. And if your role happened to involve bleeding for the state, that was just considered good civic participation. This system only worked because Sparta enslaved a massive population called the Helots. The Helots farmed the land and produced food. They did the labor. They made it possible for Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war. Naturally, the Spartans were deeply afraid of them, which is what happens when your lifestyle depends on people who outnumber you and absolutely hate you. Now, Spartan life did not start gently. It began with an inspection. When a baby was born in Sparta, elders examined it. Not doctors, not parents, elders. Men whose job it was to decide whether this infant was worth the investment. If the baby looked strong, healthy, and properly formed, it lived. If not, it could be abandoned, left exposed to die. Efficient, emotionally distant, very on brand. Historians argue about how often this actually happened, but the fact that everyone agreed it was acceptable tells you enough. Sparta didn't value individuals, it valued outcomes. If a baby survived this first hurdle, childhood still wasn't exactly cozy. Spartan boys stayed with their mothers until about age 7. This was the warmest phase of their lives, which is not saying much. At 7, boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge, the state-run education and training system. And by education, we mean controlled suffering. The agoge was designed to break comfort out of the child early. Boys lived in groups. They slept on beds made of reeds they cut themselves. No blankets, no pillows. Cold was a teacher. Food was intentionally limited, not because Sparta lacked resources, but because hunger was considered character building. The boys were encouraged to steal food to survive, but if they were caught, they were punished, not for stealing, but for being bad at it. This taught stealth, self-reliance, and a constant low-level anxiety, which Sparta considered ideal. Physical training was constant. Running, wrestling, combat drills, endurance exercises. Pain was normal. Bruises were expected. Complaining was humiliating. If a boy cried or showed fear, he was mocked, publicly, by peers and elders alike. Sparta believed shame was an effective educational tool, which tells you a lot about Sparta. As boys grew older, discipline intensified. They were expected to endure beatings without reaction. There were ritual whippings during religious festivals, sometimes severe, sometimes fatal. The point wasn't punishment, it was endurance, to suffer without showing it. Because in battle, panic could get other people killed. At least that was the theory. Then there was the Crypteia, a secretive institution that sounds mysterious and absolutely was not gentle. Selected young men were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies. They lived alone. They hid during the day. They moved at night. They were expected to kill helots they encountered, quietly. This served multiple purposes. It tested survival skills, it reinforced obedience, and it terrified the Helot population. Sparta declared war on the Helots every year, symbolically. This allowed killing them without religious consequence, which is bureaucratic brutality at its finest. By their late teens, Spartan boys were already hardened. By 20, they became full soldiers, but not full citizens yet. That required acceptance into a communal mess group, essentially a military dining club. Spartan men lived in barracks until age 30, even if they were married. They ate together, trained together, slept near each other. Meals were famously bad. The most iconic dish was black broth, made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. Visitors reportedly found it revolting. Spartans took pride in this. Enjoying food too much suggested weakness. Every man had to contribute food from his land. If he couldn't, he lost his place, which meant losing citizen status. There was no safety net, no second chances. Marriage existed, but it was strange. Men married in their 20s, but continued living in barracks. They visited their wives at night, quietly. This was supposed to prevent domestic distractions. It also made marriage feel like a covert operation. Women in Sparta had more freedom than elsewhere in Greece. They exercised, they owned property, they managed households. This wasn't feminism, it was practicality. Sparta needed strong women to produce strong sons. Love was secondary. Reproduction was the priority. If a man was weak, his wife might be encouraged to bear children with a stronger man. The goal was better soldiers, not emotional fulfillment. Spartan life was rigid, predictable, repetitive. Every day followed the same pattern: train, eat, sleep, repeat. Individual ambition was discouraged, standing out was risky. The highest honor was dying in battle. Surviving defeat was shameful. Coming home alive after failure was worse than death, which is an intense amount of pressure to carry quietly. Sparta produced excellent soldiers, but it did not produce many of them. The system was too harsh. The population slowly declined. Rigid traditions made adaptation difficult, and eventually Sparta faded. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow exhaustion. But before we drift far forward, let's slow down. In the next part, we'll sink into the daily adult life of a Spartan warrior, the routines, the silence, the emotional flatness, and the strange comfort of knowing exactly who you are allowed to be, and nothing more. All right, welcome back. Settle in again. Nothing loud is about to happen, no surprises, just long, steady endurance, which the Spartans would appreciate. By the time a Spartan man reached adulthood, most of his personality had already been gently sanded down, sharp edges removed, soft parts discouraged. What remained was something very functional, very quiet, and very tired. A Spartan warrior's daily life was built around routine, not excitement, not ambition, routine. He woke early, not because he wanted to, because that was the rule. The body learned to comply long before the mind had opinions. He slept in the barracks with other men, usually on simple bedding. Even after marriage, he lived there. Home life was optional, military readiness was not. The barracks were communal. No privacy, no personal decoration, no space for self-expression. Everything was shared, everything was observed. This constant closeness was intentional. Sparta believed isolation bred weakness, and weakness was contagious. Morning began with physical training, running, strength exercises, weapons practice, formation drills. Not flashy maneuvers, not clever tricks, just repetition. Spartan warfare relied on discipline, The phalanx formation required absolute trust. Every man's shield protected the man beside him. If one broke formation, everyone suffered. So they drilled until movement became instinct, until obedience replaced hesitation. After training came meals, always communal, always monitored. The food was simple, sparse, functional. Black broth appeared often. It was not meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to sustain. Eating too much was frowned upon, talking too much was worse. Meals were quiet. Conversation, if it happened, was brief. Cleverness was admired only if it was sharp and short. Long stories were suspicious. They suggested vanity or imagination. Both were dangerous. A Spartan man owned little. Personal wealth was discouraged. Gold and silver currency were replaced with heavy iron bars. Impractical, ugly, hard to steal. Luxury was considered corrosive. Comfort led to softness. Softness led to defeat. So Spartan homes were plain. Clothing was simple. Hair was regulated. Men wore their hair long as adults, not for vanity, but because tradition said so. Before battle, they carefully groomed it, not to look good, but to show discipline. Spartan loved appearances of control. Marriage existed, but it was not sentimental, it was civic. Spartan men married later than other Greeks, usually in their 20s. The ceremony itself was odd. The bride's hair was cut short. She wore men's clothing. The groom visited her secretly at night. This ritualized separation reinforced priorities. Marriage should not interfere with military duty. Children, when they came, were raised largely by women and the state. Fathers were distant figures, respected, feared, rarely affectionate. Emotional warmth was not part of the Spartan curriculum. Spartan men spent much of their lives preparing for war, even during peace. Peace was treated as temporary, suspicious. War, on the other hand, was familiar, predictable, comforting in a grim way. When Spartans went to battle, they moved deliberately, slowly, in formation. They marched to music. Flutes set the pace. This wasn't for morale, it was for order. Chaos was the enemy. Emotion disrupted timing. Timing disrupted survival. Spartan warriors wore red cloaks, partly tradition, partly practicality. Blood didn't show as easily. They carried heavy shields, spears, and short swords. Their armor was functional, nothing ornamental. They were not individual heroes, they were components. If a Spartan died in battle, it was honorable. If he survived victory, acceptable. If he survived defeat, shameful. Cowardice was the worst crime. Returning without your shield meant you fled. Mothers famously told sons to return with it or on it. This was not a joke. This was expectation. Men who failed were ostracized. They lost social standing. They were excluded from meals, ignored. In a society built on communal identity, isolation was devastating. Spartan punished shame quietly. No executions, no speeches, just absence. Religion in Sparta was practical. They honored gods, but not emotionally. Rituals focused on discipline and obedience. Festivals existed, but they were restrained. Even celebration followed rules. Art was minimal. Music was functional. Dance existed mostly for training. Sparta did not encourage curiosity. Exploration was rare. Travel was restricted. Foreign influence was discouraged. Spartans believed outsiders softened morals, introduced dangerous ideas, like comfort. This isolation kept traditions intact. It also made adaptation difficult. As Spartan men aged, they gained authority. Older warriors supervised younger ones. They enforced discipline. Age brought respect, not comfort. Even elderly Spartans trained, lighter exercises, but still expected to participate. Retirement did not exist. You served until your body could no longer comply, and even then, you served as an example. Death was accepted calmly, not rushed, not feared. Spartans were taught early that life was temporary, service was eternal. This worldview produced soldiers who did not panic easily, who endured hardship quietly. It also produced people who struggled with anything outside structure. Spartans were not flexible. They did not innovate quickly. As Greek warfare changed, Sparta lagged behind. New tactics emerged, new weapons. Sparta clung to tradition. Population decline worsened the problem. Citizens became fewer. The Helot population remained vast. Fear increased, rigidity intensified. Sparta doubled down on what it knew: discipline, control, endurance. Eventually, it was not enough. But for centuries, this system worked, not because it was kind, but because it was consistent. For a Spartan man, life was simple. Not easy, but simple. You knew what was expected, you knew where you belonged, you knew how you would be judged. There was comfort in that. In the next part, we'll drift towards Spartan women, their strange freedoms, their heavy expectations, and the quiet pressure of being responsible for the next generation of endurance specialists. So breathe slowly, let the rhythm settle, and we'll continue. All right. Welcome back. Get comfortable again. Nothing sudden is coming. Just another slow walk through a society that never learned how to relax. If Spartan men were shaped into weapons, Spartan women were shaped into the people who made those weapons possible, and that responsibility sat quietly on their shoulders from birth. Spartan girls did not live the soft, sheltered lives common elsewhere in Greece. They were not kept indoors. They were not trained to be delicate. They were not encouraged to disappear politely. Instead, Spartan girls were raised with a very specific goal: produce strong children. Preferably sons, but daughters mattered too, because strong mothers made strong warriors. At least, that was the theory. From a young age, Spartan girls trained physically. They ran, they wrestled, they threw discus and javelin. They exercised publicly. This shocked other Greeks. Athenians, in particular, were horrified. Women sweating outside? Absolutely not. Spartans saw it differently. Weak women produced weak children, and weak children were a liability. So girls trained with minimal clothing. Comfort was irrelevant. Modesty was flexible. Practicality ruled. Education for girls existed, though it wasn't academic in the modern sense. They learned music, dance, poetry, not for art's sake, but because rhythm, coordination, and discipline mattered. Spartan women were expected to be confident, outspoken, not submissive. They managed households while men lived in barracks. They owned property, they controlled estates. This made them unusually powerful compared to women elsewhere in Greece. But this freedom came with strings, very tight strings. Marriage for Spartan women was not romantic, it was civic duty. They married young, usually in their late teens. Their husbands were often older, already fully trained, already emotionally distant. The wedding ritual itself was strange. The bride's hair was cut short. She wore a man's cloak. She waited alone. The groom visited secretly at night, briefly, quietly. This ritualized separation reinforced priorities. Marriage was important, but not more important than the state. Spartan women were expected to bear children efficiently. Pregnancy was not treated delicately. Women continued exercising while pregnant. Birth was expected to be endured quietly. Pain was not celebrated, it was managed. After birth, the child would be inspected, and the mother had no say in the outcome. If the baby was deemed unfit, it could be exposed. This applied to sons and daughters alike. Maternal attachment was discouraged. Affection was risky. Loss was common. Spartan women were expected to accept this calmly, emotionally restrained, focused on the collective good. Mothers raised their sons to value courage above survival. Stories emphasized honor, duty, endurance. There was no space for fear. Spartan mothers were famously blunt. They did not coddle. When sons left for war, mothers did not cry publicly. They offered reminders: return victorious or do not return at all. This was not cruelty, it was expectation. Women who lost sons in battle were praised. Women whose sons fled were shamed. Grief existed, but it was private. Public emotion was controlled, just like everything else. Spartan women also played a role in maintaining social discipline. They mocked cowardly men. They reinforced norms through social pressure. Words mattered. Reputation mattered. A man shamed by women carried that weight heavily. As they aged, Spartan women gained authority. Older women commanded respect. Their opinions carried weight. But even age did not bring softness. They continued managing households, overseeing labor, raising children. Sparta depended on them to maintain stability. While men trained and fought, women ensured continuity. Spartan women also supervised health. They enforced order. They benefited directly from the system of enslavement. This power came with danger. Helots resented them deeply. Fear was mutual, always present. Spartan society rested on this tension. Citizens few, helots many. Women lived with that awareness daily. Despite their relative freedom, Spartan women were not equals. Their value was tied to reproduction. Childlessness was stigmatized. Fertility was praised. Women were encouraged to bear multiple children, especially sons. If a husband was weak or elderly, arrangements could be made. Another man could father children with the wife's consent. This was not scandalous, it was practical. Sparta valued results over feelings. Love existed, but quietly. Affection was subtle, never indulgent. Spartan women learned early not to expect emotional availability from men raised to suppress emotion. Marriage was partnership, not intimacy. As Sparta's population declined, pressure on women increased. They were urged to produce more children, stronger children. Blame quietly shifted towards them when numbers fell. This burden was heavy, but openly complaining was unacceptable. Spartan women were expected to embody strength at all times. Even in old age, they modeled endurance. They told stories of fallen sons with pride, not sorrow. This didn't mean they felt nothing. It meant feeling was private. Spartan society demanded control above all. As Sparta declined politically and militarily, women retained influence longer than men. Property concentrated in their hands. This caused tension. Traditionalists blamed women for societal weakness, because of course they did. The system strained. Old rules stopped working. But Spartan women continued their roles, managing, enduring, adapting quietly. They were not warriors, but they were not passive. They were pillars, holding up a rigid system long past its prime. In many ways, Spartan women understood the truth better than anyone. This life was not about happiness. It was about survival, reputation, legacy. And that knowledge shaped them completely. As the centuries passed, Sparta faded. Its strict system could not compete with more flexible societies, but the image of the Spartan woman endured, strong, blunt, unyielding, not because she wanted power, but because the system required it. And in the next part, we'll gently slide towards the end of the Spartan experiment, the decline, the exhaustion, and the quiet realization that even the most disciplined societies eventually run out of breath. So rest now, let the rhythm settle, and we'll continue. All right, settle back in. Nothing dramatic is about to happen. Just the slow realization that even the most disciplined societies eventually get tired. By the time Sparta reached its height, the system already carried the seeds of its own decline. It had always been rigid, always suspicious of change, and for a while that rigidity looked like strength. But rigidity, over time, becomes fragility. Sparta's military reputation rested on a very narrow foundation, a small number of full citizens, highly trained, perfectly disciplined, and increasingly rare. The Spartan population had never been large. Citizenship was exclusive. Land ownership was tightly controlled. Marriage and reproduction were regulated by tradition and pressure. As wars continued, citizens died faster than they were replaced. Training was harsh. Life expectancy was not generous. Every loss mattered. Meanwhile, the Helot population remained large, constantly present, constantly resentful. Sparta lived with permanent anxiety. Every earthquake, every rumor, every moment of weakness raised fears of rebellion. To manage this fear, Sparta doubled down on control. More surveillance, more tradition, less flexibility. This worked for a while, until it didn't. Other Greek states evolved. They adapted tactics. They experimented. Athens invested in naval power. Thebes restructured infantry formations. New strategies emerged. Sparta watched, judged, and largely refused to change. Spartan warfare relied on the hoplite phalanx, disciplined, effective, but limited. When enemies learned how to disrupt it, Sparta struggled to respond. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE marked a turning point. Spartan forces were defeated by Thebes, decisively. This was not just a loss, it was psychological damage. Spartans were supposed to be invincible, superior by design. Losing shattered that belief. Citizen casualties were severe, and unlike other states, Sparta could not easily replace them. Land consolidation worsened the problem. Property accumulated in fewer hands, often controlled by women through inheritance. This reduced the number of citizens eligible for full participation, which reduced military manpower, which increased pressure on those remaining. The system tightened. Requirements grew stricter. Exclusion increased. Sparta responded to decline by becoming more Spartan, more tradition, more rigidity. It was not enough. As the citizen class shrank, Sparta relied more heavily on non-citizen troops, periokoi, allies, mercenaries. This diluted the very identity Sparta prized. The image remained, the reality shifted. Spartan discipline still existed, but it no longer guaranteed dominance. Internally, social tension grew. The old ideals clashed with practical needs. Reform was discussed, then rejected. Change felt like betrayal. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta was no longer a major power. It survived more as an idea than a force. Visitors came to observe, to comment, to romanticize. Spartans became living relics, performers of tradition. Training continued, rituals persisted, but the world around them moved on. Eventually, Rome absorbed Greece. Sparta became a tourist attraction. Roman visitors paid to watch Spartan boys endure whippings. Old traditions turned into spectacles. Pain became performance. The agoge survived, but hollowed out. Endurance without purpose. The Spartan way lingered, faded, then disappeared quietly. What remained was the myth. Centuries later, people remembered Sparta as perfect warriors, unbreakable, fearless. The reality was slower, harsher, more constrained. Spartans lived lives defined by obligation. Choice was minimal. Comfort was suspicious. Their strength came from clarity, their weakness from inflexibility. They endured almost everything, except change. Sparta teaches us something subtle, not about heroism, but about systems. A society can optimize itself perfectly for one purpose and still fail. Discipline can replace fear, but not curiosity. Endurance can replace comfort, but not growth. Sparta did not collapse in flames. It faded, quietly, predictably. The rigid lines softened, the routines lost meaning, and eventually the silence swallowed it. But even now, the Spartan idea lingers, in slogans, in stories, in simplified myths. The truth is quieter. Spartans were not superheroes. They were people shaped by extreme structure. They learned to endure. They learned to obey. They learned to suppress. And for a time, that was enough. So as we let Sparta drift away, remember this. Strength is not just the ability to endure. It is the ability to adapt. And Sparta, for all its discipline, never quite learned how. Now rest, let the dust settle. And if you'd like, we can drift into another ancient society, another strange experiment in control and survival. Just say the word. All right. Welcome back one last time. Get settled. This is the quiet stretch near the end, where nothing urgent remains, just echoes and slow thoughts. By the time Sparta fully faded from power, it had already transformed into something else. Not a military state, not a dominant force, but a symbol. And symbols are strange things. They survive longer than reality. They simplify what was once complicated. They sand down rough edges until only a shape remains. Sparta became an idea. To later generations, Sparta meant strength, discipline, sacrifice, unbreakable resolve. The messy parts were gently ignored, the fear, the cruelty, the exhaustion. People remembered the warriors. They forgot the children raised on hunger. They forgot the helots. They forgot the silence. Ancient writers played a role in this transformation. Plutarch, writing centuries later, admired Sparta deeply. He preserved sayings, anecdotes, clean moral lessons. These stories were short, sharp, neatly packaged, perfect for legends, not perfect for truth. Roman elites loved Sparta. They saw it as a model of virtue, a corrective to decadence, which is ironic because by then, Sparta itself was gone. Roman tourists visited the ruins. They paid to watch ritual endurance displays. Young boys whipped at altars. The suffering continued, but the purpose was gone. Pain became entertainment. The agode survived as tradition, but no longer as necessity. Sparta had become theater. And this theatrical Sparta is what echoes through history. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers referenced Sparta when discussing discipline and civic virtue. Some admired it, some feared it. Revolutionaries looked to Sparta as proof that societies could mold citizens completely. Total loyalty, total sacrifice. Others saw a warning, a society so rigid it could not breathe. In the modern world, Sparta is often misunderstood, reduced to slogans, fitness mottos, warrior aesthetics. Spartan becomes shorthand for minimalism, for toughness, for grit. But real Spartan life was not sleek or motivational. It was repetitive, controlled, emotionally narrow. It was waking up tired, eating the same food, training the same way, speaking carefully. Every day. There was little room for self-discovery, little space for doubt. The system worked only as long as everyone accepted it, and as long as circumstances stayed familiar. Once the world changed, Sparta could not. Adaptation requires flexibility. Flexibility requires tolerance for difference. Sparta had none. That is why it faded quietly, not defeated in a single moment, but outpaced. The legacy of Sparta teaches something subtle, not about bravery, but about balance. Discipline without compassion becomes cruelty. Strength without adaptability becomes fragility. Spartans endured almost everything, but endurance alone is not enough. They were raised to suppress fear, but also curiosity. They were trained to obey, but not to question. They were prepared for war, but not for change. And that may be the most human part of the story. Because Sparta was not evil, it was extreme. It took a few values and magnified them until they consumed everything else. Order, discipline, sacrifice. These can be virtues, but only in proportion. The Spartan experiment shows what happens when balance disappears. And yet, there is something oddly calming about their world. Everything known, everything structured, no endless decisions, no constant reinvention, just duty, routine, expectation. In that sense, Sparta offers a strange comfort, a reminder that some people find peace in limits. But limits always cost something. They cost creativity. They cost empathy. They cost resilience. And eventually, they cost survival. As we let Sparta fully fade now, imagine the last generations, still training, still repeating rituals, still telling stories of past glory, living inside an echo, and then silence, ruins, dust, memory. What remains is not the spears or shields, but the questions. How much structure is too much? How much sacrifice is sustainable? How much endurance becomes emptiness? Sparta never answered these. It simply endured until it couldn't. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the story rest. No battles, no heroes, just people, living inside a system, doing their best to survive it. And tomorrow, the world will still be flexible, still messy, still changing, unlike Sparta. Now, breathe slowly, let the rhythm fade, and sleep. All right, welcome back. Nothing new is required of you, just staying still and letting time move slowly. This part drifts away from Sparta itself and into what followed the people who lived there. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. When the structures faded, the habits remained. People do not stop being shaped just because the system weakens. They carry it with them, in posture, in tone, in expectation. Former Spartan citizens did not suddenly become relaxed. They had spent lives suppressing comfort. They did not know what to do with it. The barracks emptied, training fields quieted, but the rhythms stayed in their bodies. Older men still woke early, still ate plainly, still spoke carefully. They corrected posture, they judged softness, even when no one asked them to. Discipline had become instinct. You can remove a law, you can remove a ritual, but removing conditioning takes generations. Sparta's decline did not create freedom overnight. It created confusion. People raised on rules struggled without them. Choice felt heavy, unclear, almost dangerous. This is the quiet cost of extreme structure. When it disappears, it leaves a vacuum. Some Spartans adapted. They traded, they traveled, they learned new ways of living. Others clung to memory. They reenacted old customs, they told old stories. They preserved identity through repetition. Rome encouraged this. It suited Roman nostalgia, a living museum of toughness. So Spartan descendants performed Spartanness. They endured, they displayed restraint, they leaned into reputation. Tourists applauded, philosophers commented, the myth hardened. Meanwhile, the Helots vanished from the story. Their labor, their fear, their endurance. History often forgets the quiet majority, especially when they are inconvenient. Sparta without Helots was impossible, but Sparta remembered without them anyway. This selective memory shaped everything that followed. Medieval thinkers romanticized discipline. Early modern writers praised order. Military reformers borrowed imagery. None borrowed the full cost. They wanted obedience, not terror, endurance, not depopulation. So they took symbols, short hair, hard training, harsh speech. They left out the hunger, the surveillance, the constant fear of uprising. Sparta became inspirational, which would have surprised actual Spartans. They did not think of themselves as inspiring. They thought of themselves as correct. Correctness mattered more than admiration. Modern culture continues this pattern. Fitness brands, motivational speeches, simplified quotes, live like a Spartan, usually means wake up early and skip dessert. Real Spartans would find this amusing and unnecessary. They skipped joy, not sugar. The myth persists because it is clean. It offers certainty, rules, identity. In uncertain times, that is attractive, but certainty always costs flexibility. Sparta is proof. What survives of Sparta is not its strength, it is its warning. Societies that narrow themselves too far lose options. They become excellent at one thing and fragile everywhere else. Sparta trained for war. It did not train for peace or change or loss. When those arrived, it struggled. This is not unique to Sparta. It is human. People cling to systems that once worked, even when conditions shift, because adaptation requires admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty feels unsafe. Spartans avoided uncertainty their entire lives. They were taught to replace it with obedience. So when obedience lost meaning, there was nothing beneath it. And yet, there is something undeniably calming about their world, from the outside. Simple days, clear roles, no endless decisions. The modern world offers too many choices, too many paths, too much noise. Sparta offers silence, order, limits. This is why it continues to fascinate. But silence can be oppressive. Limits can suffocate. Order can erase. The Spartan experiment shows that peace requires more than discipline. It requires elasticity, the ability to bend, to question, to soften. Sparta never softened, and so it cracked. As this story winds down, imagine the landscape. Quiet hills, ruined stone, wind moving through grass. No marching, no flutes, just space. The people are gone, the habits faded, only memory remains. And memory, like myth, simplifies. So when you hear Spartan in the future, remember the whole picture. Not just strength, but cost. Not just endurance, but loss. Memory prefers clean lines. It removes contradictions. It keeps what flatters. But real lives are uneven. They are tired. They are repetitive. They are quietly complicated. Spartan lives were no exception. Most Spartans never saw legendary battles. They trained, they waited, they trained again. They lived long stretches of routine, occasional fear, rare glory, mostly maintenance. They maintained bodies, they maintained discipline, they maintained reputation. Maintenance is not glamorous, but it is most of life. When historians skip this, they miss the point. The Spartan system excelled at maintenance until it exhausted its resources. People are not infinite. Patience wears down. Bodies weaken. Traditions strain. Eventually, something gives. For Sparta, it was adaptability. For individuals, it was often quiet fatigue. Men who had never been allowed to rest, women who had never been allowed to grieve, children trained before they understood why. These costs did not explode, they accumulated, and accumulation is hard to dramatize, which is why Sparta fades rather than fall. No single moment, no final scream, just fewer citizens, fewer soldiers, less relevance. The system shrank. The myth expanded. That trade happens often. As listeners, it's tempting to admire endurance, to crave structure, to imagine ourselves thriving under clarity. But clarity without choice is a narrow life. Sparta answered every question in advance. It left no room for personal meaning. Meaning was assigned, and that assignment was non-negotiable. Some people find comfort in that. Others disappear inside it. Sparta did not ask which you were. It decided. That's its legacy. Not heroism, not brutality alone, but certainty enforced at scale. As you rest now, let that thought drift. No judgment, no lesson forced, just awareness. History does not exist to inspire or condemn. It exists to show what happened. Sparta happened, fully, completely, and then it ended. And the world kept moving, slowly, quietly, indifferently. Now there is nothing left to do. No more analysis, no more endurance. Just sleep. All right. If you're still here, that means the night is deep enough. The kind of deep where thoughts soften around the edges and history feels far away and very slow. This last stretch isn't really about Sparta anymore, not directly. It's about why we keep coming back to it. Why a society that vanished so completely still occupies space in tired minds centuries later. Because Sparta refuses to stay buried. It lingers, quietly, like an old rule you no longer follow but still feel when you hesitate. Sparta survives because it offers certainty, and certainty is comforting when the world feels unmanageable. The Spartan system answered every question in advance: what you do, who you are, what matters, what doesn't. There is relief in that. No wandering, no searching, no endless comparison, just a path. Narrow, hard, clear. Modern life is the opposite. Too many choices, too many identities, too much noise. So people look back and imagine strength. They imagine simplicity. They imagine clarity. They imagine Sparta. But what they imagine is not what lived there. Real Spartans did not wake up feeling inspired. They woke up because the routine demanded it. They trained because deviation was punished. They endured because there was no alternative. There was no self-improvement, no self-expression, no concept of becoming something else. You were shaped early, then maintained. And maintenance was relentless. We often confuse endurance with fulfillment. Sparta reminds us they are not the same. Spartan lives were not exciting. They were repetitive, measured, closely watched. Days blurred together, training cycles repeated, meals tasted the same. This was not a life of constant heroism. It was a life of constant readiness. Most Spartans never fought in legendary battles. They prepared for them endlessly. They waited. Waiting was the real experience. Waiting while hungry, waiting while sore, waiting while suppressing doubt. Sparta trains people to endure waiting better than almost anyone, and that skill shaped everything. They waited for war, they waited for approval, they waited for death, and they did so quietly. Silence was not just cultural, it was structural. Silence prevented dissent. Silence prevented reflection. Silence kept the system intact. When people cannot articulate dissatisfaction, it never challenges power. Sparta perfected that. Which is why its decline feels strange. It didn't collapse under protest, it simply aged. Its rules outlived their usefulness. Its discipline outlasted its context. And without context, even the strongest structure becomes brittle. That brittleness didn't shatter dramatically, it eroded, bit by bit, generation by generation. Spartan children continued training long after the purpose thinned. Spartan adults enforced rules whose origins they barely remembered. That's how traditions die. Not when they're challenged, but when they're repeated without understanding. Eventually, discipline becomes theater, endurance becomes spectacle, pain becomes proof instead of preparation. Rome saw this clearly and used it. Sparta became a performance of itself, a curated endurance experience. People paid to watch Spartan boys suffer, not because it was necessary, but because it was expected. That is a quiet kind of tragedy. Suffering preserved purely because it is familiar. Sparta did not notice when survival turned into habit, and habits are powerful. They persist even when they no longer serve. That is why Sparta feels relevant now. We still build systems around productivity, around discipline, around optimization. We still praise exhaustion as virtue. We still equate worth with endurance. We still tell people to push through, to suppress, to toughen up. Sparta did this first, at scale, with precision, and it paid the price slowly. This isn't a warning shouted loudly, it's a reminder, whispered. Endurance is useful, but it is not infinite. Discipline is powerful, but it is not sufficient. Structure creates stability, but only if it can bend. Sparta could not bend. That doesn't make it evil, it makes it human. It committed fully to a vision and never adjusted. Most societies fail this way, not from weakness, but from overcommitment. As this story finally fades, imagine a Spartan elder, sitting quietly, no armor, no formation, just memory. He remembers training fields filled with boys, barracks loud with routine, certainty everywhere. Now the fields are empty, the rules feel distant, the silence is different, not enforced, natural. There is nothing left to endure, and that might feel unsettling, because when endurance is all you know, rest feels unfamiliar. This is the final cost Sparta never prepared for, what happens when the struggle ends. The system did not teach how to live without pressure, only how to survive within it. So when pressure vanished, meaning thinned, and meaning matters more than strength. That is why Sparta fades into quiet reflection rather than triumphant memory. Its legacy is not victory, it is clarity. Clarity about limits, clarity about cost. Sparta shows us what happens when a society perfects endurance but neglects flexibility. It becomes excellent at surviving conditions that no longer exist. And that is where the story finally rests. No lesson shouted, no judgment imposed, just awareness drifting gently into the background. History is not here to inspire sleepless ambition tonight. It's here to slow the mind, to remind us that even the most disciplined systems end, and that ending does not need to be loud. It can be quiet, like this. So let the story release you now. No more warriors, no more rules, just stillness, the kind Sparta never practiced. And sleep comes easier after that. Good night. All right, settle back in. This part moves slowly. Nothing sharp, nothing demanding. By now, Sparta is no longer a place. It's a concept, and concepts are harder to put to sleep than ruins. Long after the last Spartan citizen stopped training in formation, the idea of Sparta kept marching, quietly, persistently. Ideas don't need food, they don't age, they don't question themselves. That's why Sparta survives better as a myth than it ever did as a society. Once removed from reality, it becomes tidy. No starving children, no frightened helots, no exhausted men pretending they aren't tired. Just strength, discipline, order. A very clean fantasy. Philosophers loved this version. They could point to Sparta as proof that humans could be shaped, that chaos could be restrained, that freedom was optional. Of course they did. Philosophers love order, especially when they don't have to live under it. Plutarch polished Sparta gently, removed the rough edges, kept the clever sayings. Short quotes survive better than long suffering. Later thinkers repeated these lines, copied them, shared them. Sparta became a collection of sayings instead of lives. Come back with your shield or on it. Very efficient, very quotable. Less space is given to what came after, the grief, the loss, the silence. Quotes don't carry exhaustion well. As centuries passed, Sparta was repurposed again and again. Each age shaped it to fit its needs. Military academies admired its training. Nationalists admired its unity. Authoritarians admired its obedience. They all borrowed selectively. No one wanted the full system, just the parts that sounded impressive. This is how myths spread, by convenience. Sparta's reputation hardened during times of uncertainty. When people feared disorder, they looked backward. Backward feels safer. The past cannot surprise you. You already know how it ends. That makes it comforting. Sparta offered an image of control in a world that rarely feels controlled. But the image was incomplete. The real Spartan system required constant fear to function. Fear of failure, fear of weakness, fear of uprising. Fear is not stability. It is pressure. Pressure works until it doesn't. This is what the myth hides. Modern interpretations often treat Spartan training like a motivational poster. Cold showers, early mornings, no excuses. They call it discipline. But Spartan discipline was not chosen, it was imposed before choice existed. A 7-year-old does not choose discipline, he adapts. There is a difference, and that difference matters. Choice builds resilience. Imposition builds compliance. Sparta built compliance. Compliance is quiet. It looks like peace until it isn't. The myth ignores this distinction because it complicates admiration, and admiration prefers simplicity. This is why Sparta shows up in movies, books, speeches. It provides a visual shorthand. Shields, red cloaks, short phrases. The human cost is harder to visualize, so it's skipped. That skipping allows the myth to feel soothing instead of unsettling, which brings us back to sleep. Stories we return to at night are rarely honest. They are comforting. Sparta's myth comforts people who crave order, who feel overwhelmed by choice, who want rules that cannot be questioned. But real comfort requires flexibility, not rigidity. Sparta mistook control for peace. Peace requires trust, and Sparta did not trust its people. It trained them, it watched them, it tested them, but it never relaxed. A society that never relaxes cannot last. Bodies break, minds resist, numbers shrink. That happened quietly in Sparta. No dramatic collapse, just fewer citizens each generation, fewer families, less relevance. When something fades slowly, people assume it was natural, but slowness is still consequence. This is the part history rarely emphasizes.
We love endings that feel earned, victories, defeats. Sparta's ending was neither. It was attrition. Attrition is boring, which makes it easy to forget, but attrition is how most systems fail. They don't fall, they thin. They lose adaptability. They lose people. They lose meaning. Sparta lost all three. And yet, the idea remains intact. Ideas don't need adaptation, they only need repetition, which is why Sparta will continue to be referenced, especially in moments of stress. When societies feel fragile, they dream of strength. When individuals feel overwhelmed, they admire endurance. Sparta offers both, in theory. In reality, it offers a caution. Strength without softness becomes brittle. Endurance without purpose becomes suffering. Sparta shows what happens when survival becomes the only goal. Life narrows, possibility disappears, and eventually survival itself becomes pointless. This isn't a dramatic lesson, it's a quiet one, perfect for drifting. As this final stretch slows even further, imagine the ruins again. Stones warmed by sun, grass growing where formations once stood. No commands, no inspection, just time. Time does what no enemy could. It dissolves. Sparta resisted change fiercely. Time ignored that resistance. It always does. And now, Sparta exists only where we imagine it, which means it says more about us than about them. When we admire Sparta, we reveal what we value: discipline, certainty, strength. When we critique it, we reveal other values: freedom, choice, balance. Both reactions are human. Sparta simply provides the mirror, and mirrors are useful, but they do not need to be lived inside. So let the image fade now. Let the myth soften. No shields, no drills, just rest. History has done its work tonight. It does not need to convince you of anything. It only needed to pass by slowly enough for sleep to catch up. And now it has. Good night.
All right. This is the long exhale. Nothing new to learn, nothing to remember later. Just a slow drift as the story loosens its grip. By now, Sparta isn't marching anymore. It isn't training. It isn't enforcing anything. It's just an echo, and echoes only exist because something has already stopped. What remains of Sparta now lives entirely in imagination, in phrases, in aesthetics, in simplified lessons. And that's usually how intense societies end, not with understanding, but with reduction. They get boiled down into something manageable, something portable. Sparta becomes discipline, strength, grit. 3 words, very neat. Real life is never neat. Real Sparta was messy in quiet ways, anxious, rigid, afraid of softness. Fear drove much of its behavior: fear of disorder, fear of rebellion, fear of change. A society built on fear doesn't look dramatic every day. It looks controlled. That's the trick. From the outside, it appears calm, predictable, strong. From the inside, it feels tight, restrictive, unforgiving. Spartans didn't talk about fear. They didn't name it. They trained around it. Training can hide many things. It gives the illusion of purpose. As long as you are busy enduring, you don't ask why. That worked for centuries, until it didn't. And when it stopped working, there was no backup identity. Sparta had one version of a good life, no alternatives. So when that version lost relevance, meaning thinned. This is where myths begin to form, when reality becomes too fragile to hold. People replace complexity with admiration. It's easier to admire than to understand. Understanding requires sitting with discomfort. Admiration allows distance. That distance makes Sparta feel safe to revisit, safe enough for bedtime, because bedtime stories don't need full honesty. They need rhythm, familiar shapes. Sparta provides that rhythm: early rising, training, meals, rest, repeat. It's almost meditative when stripped of consequence, which is why the myth works so well for sleep-inducing reflection. But real Spartans didn't sleep easily, not deeply. They slept lightly, alert, always half ready. Even rest was controlled. That kind of life produces endurance, but not peace. Peace requires permission to relax. Sparta never gave permission. So when people today say they want Spartan discipline, what they usually want is focus, structure, boundaries. Not constant evaluation, not fear of punishment, not identity enforcement. They want the aesthetic, not the experience, which is understandable. Experiences are heavier. Sparta's experience required surrender, not just effort. Surrender of choice, surrender of deviation, surrender of softness. Some people romanticize that surrender, especially when modern life feels overwhelming. Too many choices can feel like pressure. Sparta removes choice entirely. That feels peaceful in theory. In practice, it's suffocating. The Spartan system assumed people were interchangeable, useful primarily as units. Individual needs were irrelevant unless they served the whole. That approach creates efficiency and emptiness. Humans eventually notice emptiness. They don't always rebel. Sometimes they just stop investing. That's what happened in Sparta. Citizens stopped having children, stopped expanding families, stopped replenishing the system. Quiet resistance, biological exhaustion. No speeches, no protests, just decline. The system demanded too much for too long. Endurance has limits, even when praised. That's the part the myth forgets. Because limits are inconvenient, they complicate the message, and simple messages survive longer. So Sparta becomes timeless, even though it wasn't. It was extremely time-bound. It worked in a specific place, under specific conditions, for a limited period. Remove any of those, and it falters, which makes it very human. Sparta wasn't a mistake, it was an experiment in extreme structure. And like many experiments, it revealed trade-offs: security for freedom, order for adaptability, endurance for joy. It chose one side consistently. That consistency is impressive and costly. As this final echo fades further, notice how calm everything feels now. No commands, no expectations, just quiet narration drifting. This is what Sparta never allowed: unstructured stillness. Stillness invites thought. Thought invites questioning. Sparta avoided both. That avoidance kept it stable until the world moved on. The world always moves on. Systems that don't move with it become artifacts. Sparta is an artifact now, handled carefully, observed, sometimes admired, but not inhabited. And that's good. Some ideas belong in history, not daily life. Sparta teaches best from a distance, from the quiet safety of reflection, where no one is required to endure anything. Just listen and then let go. This is where the story loosens completely. No more warriors, no more discipline, just night. If you notice thoughts drifting, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. History has done its job. It passed by slowly, without urgency, without demand. And now it steps aside, leaving space, and silence, and rest.
That's all Sparta can offer now, and that's enough.
All right. This is the point where the story barely moves at all. No effort required, no attention demanded. Sparta is very far away now, so far that it no longer feels historical. It feels abstract, like a shape you recognize without needing to name. That's usually how the past ends, not with clarity, but with distance. At this distance, Sparta becomes less about warriors and more about patterns. Patterns humans repeat quietly. The desire for order, the fear of chaos, the temptation to believe that harder rules produce better people. These ideas outlive any city. Sparta was simply one of the earliest places to commit fully to them. No hesitation, no moderation. All in. And because it went all in, it left behind a clear outline, clear enough to study, clear enough to borrow from, clear enough to misunderstand. Most societies borrow selectively. They take discipline without surveillance, unity without coercion, strength without sacrifice. That borrowing works for a while, until pressure increases, and then the questions return. How much control is too much? How much endurance is sustainable? How much identity can be imposed before it hollows out the person wearing it? Sparta answered these questions once, very confidently. History quietly disagreed. The Spartan system assumed people could be shaped endlessly without consequence, that fear and pride could replace flexibility. It assumed stability was permanent if enforced hard enough. But stability is never permanent. It has to be renewed gently. Sparta renewed itself through repetition, not renewal. That difference matters. Repetition preserves form. Renewal preserves meaning. Sparta preserved form extremely well. Meaning eroded. When meaning erodes, systems keep moving out of habit. They look functional. They feel empty. That emptiness doesn't announce itself. It settles in. Parents raise children into traditions they no longer feel connected to. Citizens follow laws they no longer understand. Leaders enforce rules because that's what leaders do. This quiet continuation can last generations, which is why Sparta didn't notice it was fading. From the inside, everything felt normal. Routine is excellent at hiding decay. Only outsiders noticed the thinning, the reduced numbers, the rigidity. By the time Sparta noticed, it was too late, not because of invasion, but because there was nothing left to adapt with. Adaptation requires flexibility. Flexibility requires tolerance for uncertainty. Sparta rejected uncertainty completely, which brings us gently back to the present. Modern life is uncertain, overwhelmingly so. That's why Sparta keeps resurfacing. When uncertainty grows, people fantasize about certainty, about rules that remove doubt, about identities that don't require negotiation. Sparta represents that fantasy cleanly, but fantasy removes friction. Reality includes it. The real Spartan life involved constant friction between obedience and fatigue, between reputation and reality, between survival and meaning. That wear wore people down, and wear doesn't make noise, it just makes things thinner. Sparta thinned until it could no longer sustain itself, and now, centuries later, we are left with the outline. An outline that feels comforting at a distance, like a bedtime story that reassures by being predictable. That's what this has become now. Not a lesson, not a warning, just a slow-moving story that no longer asks anything of you. Sparta cannot demand endurance anymore. It cannot enforce discipline. It cannot evaluate strength. All it can do is exist as an idea,
and ideas are easy to put down when you're tired. That's the advantage of distance. As the narration slows further, imagine the land again, not the myth, not the shields, just hills, wind, stone. Civilizations pass through landscapes briefly, then the landscape resumes. Sparta was brief, even if it felt eternal to those inside it. Everything feels eternal from the inside. That's another quiet lesson. The systems we live within feel permanent. They feel inevitable, but they aren't. They are temporary responses to temporary conditions. Sparta responded to fear with structure, to vulnerability with discipline. It worked for a time. Then the conditions changed, and the response stayed the same. That mismatch is where decline begins, slowly, quietly, without drama. That kind of ending suits a story meant for sleep. No climax, no resolution, just fading relevance. The Spartan way did not end in triumph or disaster. It ended in irrelevance, which is far more common. Most things do. They simply stop being necessary. And necessity is what gives systems power. When necessity disappears, power dissolves. Sparta lost its necessity, and with it, its future. Now it lives only in thought, and thought grows soft at night. You don't need to carry any of this forward. You don't need to remember names or dates, just the feeling, the slow rhythm, the sense of something once rigid becoming distant. That distance is calming. It reminds us that even the most demanding systems eventually loosen, that endurance is not required forever, that rest arrives. And now, rest is here. No warriors, no rules, no expectations, just stillness. And if sleep comes now, that's fine. If it already has, even better. This is where the story naturally ends. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because nothing more needs to be said.
All right. This is the part where even the idea of effort feels unnecessary. The story isn't moving forward anymore. It's settling. Sparta has been reduced to something very light now, almost weightless, a concept floating rather than standing. That's usually the final stage of history, when it stops asking to be understood and just exists quietly in the background. At this distance, Sparta isn't impressive or alarming. It's neutral, which would have confused the Spartans themselves. They did not aim for neutrality. They aimed for permanence. They wanted a system so firm it would never need revision, a society so disciplined it could not drift. And yet, here we are, drifting past it. This is not irony meant to sting. It's just how time behaves. Time doesn't argue. It doesn't criticize. It simply continues. Sparta was certain. Time was patient. Patience always wins. When people inside Sparta imagined the future, they imagined continuity, more training, more discipline, more of the same. They did not imagine quiet irrelevance. No one does. Most systems assume tomorrow will look like today, just slightly adjusted. Sparta assumed that harder enforcement would preserve identity, but identity cannot be preserved through force alone. It requires meaning, and meaning is fragile. Spartan meaning depended on constant external threat, on the idea that survival required total commitment. When threats changed, the meaning weakened. The rules stayed, the justification faded. That gap is uncomfortable. It creates confusion. Confusion is dangerous in rigid systems, so Sparta ignored it. Ignoring discomfort is easier than adapting to it, especially when adaptation risks unraveling everything. This is another reason the myth persists. The myth never had to adapt. It froze Sparta at its most dramatic moment. Shields raised, formation tight. That image doesn't age. Real people do. Real people grew tired. They aged out of training.
they buried children. None of that appears in the myth. The myth doesn't include grief or doubt or boredom, but boredom matters. Boredom erodes loyalty quietly. Endless repetition without renewal turns duty into weight. Sparta offered no release from duty, only deeper commitment. That works best for short periods, not centuries. And yet, it lasted centuries, which is why it still fascinates. Sparta proves humans can endure extreme structure for a very long time, but it also proves endurance is not infinite. Eventually, even the most disciplined systems reach a point where they are only sustaining themselves. At that point, they stop serving the people within them. They exist for their own continuation. Sparta crossed that line slowly. No announcement, no reform debate, just fewer citizens willing or able to continue. Population decline is not dramatic, it is quiet and mathematical. Numbers shrink, roles concentrate, pressure increases. That pressure accelerates decline. A feedback loop. Sparta entered that loop and never escaped. This is not unique. Empires do this, corporations do this, families do this. They confuse structure with health. Structure can hide fragility. Sparta was structured perfectly. It was fragile underneath. The system depended on precise balance, helot labor, citizen numbers, military relevance. When any of those shifted, the whole thing wobbled, and wobbling was not allowed. So instead of adjusting, it stiffened. Stiffness feels like strength until it breaks. Sparta avoided breaking by thinning instead, a slow vanishing. As this final reflection drifts further, notice how calm that ending feels. No tragedy, no triumph, just fading importance. That's how most histories end. We remember the loud parts, but most of existence is quiet maintenance and quiet disappearance. Sparta's true legacy is not the battles, it's the demonstration of how far humans can push order, and what happens when order becomes the only value. Order removes chaos, but it also removes spontaneity. Spontaneity is where new meaning forms. Sparta left no space for that. Everything had a place, everything had a rule. Rules do not dream. People do. And when people cannot dream within a system, they dream outside it. Sparta's citizens eventually did that, by leaving, by not reproducing, by disengaging. No rebellion, just withdrawal. Withdrawal is the gentlest form of resistance. It requires no confrontation. It simply refuses to continue. That refusal ended Sparta more effectively than any enemy. And now, nothing remains that can demand your attention. This story has stretched long enough to become soft. You don't need to remember details. You don't need to form opinions. You can let it dissolve. Sparta has already done so. All that remains is the rhythm of words slowing down, the cadence flattening, the past becoming background noise. That is where history belongs at night, not as instruction, not as warning, just as motion passing by. You are not required to endure anything now. No discipline, no vigilance, just rest. Sparta trained people never to rest fully, to always be prepared. Tonight, preparation is unnecessary. Nothing is expected. The story has reached the point where it naturally stops, not because it ran out of content, but because attention has done enough work. The mind no longer needs stimulation. It needs quiet, and quiet is here. So let the image finally fade. No warriors, no myths, just night and sleep.
All right. If you're still listening, you're doing exactly enough. No focus required, no effort at all. This part doesn't carry Sparta forward. It lets it lie still. At this point, Sparta isn't even an echo anymore. It's more like a temperature. a faint impression of firmness in a world that keeps softening as the night goes on. That's usually the final transformation of the past, from story to idea to feeling. And feelings don't need explanation. Sparta has become the feeling of rigidity remembered vaguely, like recalling a rule from childhood without remembering who enforced it. You just know it existed. For the people who lived inside Sparta, life was never abstract. It was physical, concrete. Cold mornings, hard ground, meals that barely changed. They didn't think in theories, they thought in routines. Wake, train, eat, endure, sleep lightly. Repeat. That repetition shaped minds as much as bodies. When repetition lasts long enough, it feels natural, inevitable. Spartans didn't ask whether their system was good or bad. They asked whether it was followed. That distinction matters. A system that prioritizes obedience over reflection can last a very long time, but it cannot renew itself. Renewal requires asking uncomfortable questions. Sparta avoided those completely. As the world around it shifted, Sparta stayed fixed, which felt strong until it felt isolating. Isolation isn't dramatic at first, it's quiet. Trade routes change, alliances shift, ideas circulate elsewhere. Sparta watched these changes carefully and mostly rejected them. Change was suspicious. Foreignness was risky. Innovation was unnecessary. Those beliefs protected Sparta for a time. Then they trapped it. This is where the story slows even further. Because decline, in reality, is mostly waiting. Waiting for relevance to return, waiting for threats that justify the old rules, waiting for a reason to keep going exactly as before. Sparta waited. And while it waited, other societies adapted. Adaptation doesn't look impressive in myths. It looks messy, inconsistent, but it works. Sparta did not want messy, so it accepted shrinking instead. A smaller citizen body, a narrower future. Eventually, Sparta became a place people visited for its past rather than its present. That moment matters. When your value lies behind you, not ahead, something fundamental has shifted. Spartans were trained to look forward only to duty, not possibility. So when duty lost clarity, the future blurred. And blurred futures don't inspire children. Children sense when meaning is thin. They comply, but they don't invest. That quiet lack of investment ended Sparta more surely than force. No anger, no revolt, just absence. Absence is powerful. It doesn't argue, it doesn't negotiate, it simply leaves space where something once was. Now, centuries later, that space is filled with interpretation. Historians fill it with analysis, writers fill it with drama, motivational speakers fill it with slogans, but the actual space remains empty. No Spartan voices remain to object, which is why the myth feels stable. It cannot be contradicted by lived experience anymore, only reinterpreted. This is why Sparta feels timeless. Timeless things are usually incomplete. They survive by omission. Tonight, we've let some of that omission soften, not to correct it aggressively, just to balance it. Balance matters for rest. Too much admiration energizes the mind. Too much critique does the same. Neutrality allows sleep. And Sparta, at this distance, is neutral. Neither model nor monster, just a human attempt at certainty. Certainty rarely ages well, but it always appeals when the world feels uncertain. That appeal is understandable. There is comfort in imagining a place where everyone knew their role, where doubt was not allowed to linger, where identity was assigned early and never questioned. But comfort built on suppression has a cost. Sparta paid that cost gradually, so gradually that it almost feels gentle, which makes it suitable for this moment. A story that ends not with collapse, but with quiet thinning. As you lie here now, there is no need to judge Sparta. Judgment wakes the mind. Instead, let it pass like weather. A system rose, it functioned, it hardened, it faded. That pattern repeats endlessly. Empires, ideologies, trends, even personal habits. Nothing stays rigid forever. That's not failure. That's motion. Sparta resisted motion as long as it could. Time moved anyway. Time always does. And now, time has moved past this story too. The narration doesn't need to build anymore. It doesn't need to conclude sharply. It just slows. Words space out. Thoughts drift. History becomes texture rather than content. That's the ideal place to leave it. No demands, no lessons underlined. Just the sense that something once mattered deeply to many people, and now it doesn't need to. Which is oddly comforting, because it reminds us that the pressures we feel now will also fade. They won't vanish dramatically. They'll loosen quietly. Just like this. Just like Sparta. Nothing more is required from you. No endurance, no discipline. Just stillness. The night has taken over the task of holding things together. You can let go. And if sleep hasn't already arrived, it will so, soon. Without effort, without command, simply because nothing is left to keep you awake. All right, this is where the night feels wide and very slow. The kind of slow where you're not sure how long you've been listening and it doesn't really matter anymore. Sparta is barely a word now. It's more like a faint outline behind the eyes, something once solid that has softened into atmosphere. That's usually the last stage of any long story, when details fall away and only tone remains. At this point, Sparta isn't a city, it isn't an army, it isn't even a system. It's just the idea of firmness dissolving into rest, which is appropriate because rest was the one thing Sparta never truly mastered. Spartan life was designed to prevent relaxation. Relaxation invited thought. Thought invited doubt. So everything worked against stillness. Meals were short, sleep was light, speech was controlled. Even leisure was regulated. The result was endurance without ease. That sounds impressive until you imagine living inside it. No slow mornings, no wandering thoughts, no permission to drift. Drifting was dangerous. And yet drifting is what humans do naturally, which is why the Spartan system required constant effort. It fought human nature rather than working with it. That fight can last a long time, but it can't last forever. Eventually, nature wins quietly. People slow down, they disengage, they stop pushing as hard, not in rebellion, just in exhaustion. Sparta did not collapse under attack, it dissolved under fatigue. Fatigue isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it shows up as indifference. Children less interested in tradition, adults less invested in reputation. Rules followed mechanically, not passionately. That shift is subtle, hard to notice from inside. By the time it's visible, it's irreversible. Sparta crossed that threshold without ceremony, which is why its ending feels like silence rather than closure. No final stand, no defining moment, just the slow replacement of necessity with habit. And habit, without meaning, eventually fades. The myth, however, does not fatigue. The myth. All right. This is where the night feels wide and very slow. The kind of slow where you're not sure how long you've been listening and it doesn't really matter anymore. Sparta is barely a word now. It's more like a faint outline behind the eyes, something once solid that has softened into atmosphere. That's usually the last stage of any long story, when details fall away and only tone remains. At this point, Sparta isn't a city, it isn't an army, it isn't even a system. It's just the idea of firmness dissolving into rest, which is appropriate because rest was the one thing Sparta never truly mastered. Spartan life was designed to prevent relaxation. Relaxation invited thought. Thought invited doubt. So everything worked against stillness. Meals were short, sleep was light, speech was controlled. Even leisure was regulated. The result was endurance without ease. That sounds impressive until you imagine living inside it. No slow mornings, no wandering thoughts, no permission to drift. Drifting was dangerous. And yet drifting is what humans do naturally, which is why the Spartan system required constant effort. It fought human nature rather than working with it. That fight can last a long time, but it can't last forever. Eventually, nature wins quietly. People slow down, they disengage, they stop pushing as hard, not in rebellion, just in exhaustion. Sparta did not collapse under attack, it dissolved under fatigue. Fatigue isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up as indifference. Children less interested in tradition, adults less invested in reputation. Rules followed mechanically, not passionately. That shift is subtle, hard to notice from inside. By the time it's visible, it's irreversible. Sparta crossed that threshold without ceremony, which is why its ending feels like silence rather than closure. No final stand, no defining moment, just the slow replacement of necessity with habit. And habit, without meaning, eventually fades. The myth, however, does not fatigue. The myth does not wake early, it does not train, it does not age. So it persists. People return to it when they feel overwhelmed, when life feels unstructured, when freedom feels like pressure. They look at Sparta and imagine simplicity, a world with fewer choices, clear expectations, no ambiguity. But ambiguity is where gentleness lives. Sparta left no room for gentleness. Gentleness was seen as weakness, and weakness was dangerous. That belief kept Sparta alert. It also kept it tense. Tension is not sustainable. Eventually, something must loosen. In Sparta, what loosened was belief. Belief in the future, belief in relevance, belief that continuing exactly as before still mattered. Once belief thins, enforcement must increase. But enforcement without belief accelerates decline. That cycle played out slowly, too slowly to feel dramatic, which is why it's perfect for a night like this. A story that doesn't spike attention, that doesn't ask you to stay alert. It simply moves at the pace of erosion. Erosion doesn't rush. Water smooths stone patiently. Time smooths civilizations the same way. Sparta was worn down by time, not shattered by it. And now, time has worn this story thin too. You may notice your thoughts drifting away from the words. That's not failure, that's success. It means the story has done its work. History, at night, isn't meant to instruct. It's meant to occupy the mind gently until it no longer needs occupation. Sparta once occupied every waking moment of its citizens' lives. Tonight, it barely occupies a corner of thought. That contrast is peaceful. Imagine how strange rest would have felt to a Spartan. Unstructured rest, no purpose attached, just lying still without preparing for anything. That kind of rest would have felt unsafe, unproductive. And yet it's the most natural thing in the world. Rest doesn't need justification. Sparta never accepted that, which is why its people rarely experienced true stillness. Their stillness was always conditional, temporary, monitored. The system trusted no one completely, not even itself. That mistrust required constant reinforcement, and constant reinforcement wears systems out. Sparta lasted as long as it did because it was relentless, but relentlessness has a cost. Eventually, people choose quiet over rigor, not by protest, but by absence. They leave. They stop participating. They stop reproducing the system. That's how Sparta ended, not with a roar, but with a thinning presence. And now, centuries later, the presence is so thin it barely registers, which allows it to be calming rather than commanding. That transformation from command to calm is the final irony. Sparta demanded attention. Now it barely asks for it. It once structured lives. Now it fills time softly. It once enforced discipline. Now it helps people fall asleep. That's not an insult. It's a kind of peace. Everything eventually becomes harmless, even the most rigid systems. As the night deepens, the idea of Sparta loosens further. It's no longer an example, no longer a warning, just a passing shape. And shapes don't need to be held onto. You don't need to remember what came before or what comes next. The story is no longer linear, it's ambient. Words arrive and pass without effort. This is the opposite of Spartan training. No focus drills, no endurance tests, just permission to drift. If thoughts wander elsewhere, let them. If sleep arrives, welcome it. Nothing here requires vigilance. Sparta once demanded vigilance at all times. Tonight demands nothing. The contrast is complete. This is where the story naturally thins out into silence, not because it's finished in a formal sense, but because attention has softened enough to let go. Sparta has been reduced to background texture, like distant wind, like a low hum that fades when you stop listening for it. And that's the best place to leave it. No final statement, no moral, just quiet, the kind that doesn't need discipline to maintain. All right. This is the point where even the idea of continuation feels optional. The story isn't moving forward, it's dissolving. Sparta, by now, is barely a contour, a faint pressure in memory, something that once required attention and now asks for none. That's usually how long stories end, not with resolution, but with release. If you tried to describe Sparta at this moment, you might struggle, not because you forgot facts, but because the shape has softened too much to grab. And that's fine. Sparta spent its entire existence trying not to soften, trying to remain sharp, defined, unyielding. It trained bodies to resist weakness. It trained minds to resist doubt. It trained culture to resist change. Resistance was its identity. But resistance requires constant energy, and energy is never infinite.
The Spartans believed discipline could replace everything else, that if rules were strict enough, life would stay ordered. For a while, that belief worked. Order reduces friction. Friction creates uncertainty. Uncertainty invites fear. Sparta hated fear unless it was controlled. So fear was redirected outward, toward enemies, toward helots, toward deviation. Inside the system, calm was enforced. That calm looked like peace. It wasn't. It was tension held perfectly still. Holding tension takes effort, and effort, sustained long enough, becomes fatigue. Sparta did not fail suddenly. It tired. Tired societies don't announce themselves. They don't revolt dramatically. They slow down. Rules are followed less precisely. Traditions feel heavier. The future feels smaller. This kind of tiredness spreads quietly. Parents stop pushing children as hard. Children comply without belief. Institutions persist out of habit. Sparta moved through this phase without noticing. From inside, everything felt familiar. Familiarity is comforting. It also hides decay. That's why decline feels invisible until it's complete. By the time Sparta realized it was no longer central to the Greek world, it didn't know how to become anything else. It had no alternate identity. A system built entirely around endurance has nowhere to go when endurance is no longer needed. There was no transition plan, no soft landing, just gradual irrelevance. Which is strangely gentle. Harsh systems often end quietly, not because they are merciful, but because they leave no space for dramatic opposition. Opposition requires energy. Sparta had drained it. So what remains centuries later is calm. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of distance. Distance removes urgency. Urgency is what keeps the mind alert. Without it, attention relaxes. That's where we are now. This story no longer contains pressure, no expectations, no sharp edges. The warriors are gone. The drills are gone. Even the myth is fading. All that remains is the sensation of something once firm becoming loose. And looseness is what sleep needs. The Spartan system trained people to remain rigid even at rest, to sleep lightly, to remain prepared. Prepared for what exactly changed over time. Eventually, preparedness became a habit without a purpose. Habits without purpose feel empty. Emptiness is uncomfortable at first, then it becomes quiet. Quiet can feel peaceful if you stop trying to fill it. Sparta never stopped trying, which is why its quiet came after it ended. Now, centuries later, the quiet is complete. No one is enforcing rules. No one is being watched. No one is evaluating worth. That absence is gentle. And gentleness feels unfamiliar when you've been listening to stories of endurance. But unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. It just means different. As you rest here, there's no need to hold on to the narrative. No need to recall timelines or structures. History doesn't require memory to exist. It's already done. This part is not about teaching or concluding. It's about letting go. Sparta spent its life refusing to let go of anything: rules, traditions, control. Letting go would have felt like failure, but letting go is also how tension releases. The night is very good at teaching this. You don't have to do anything for sleep to arrive. You don't have to earn it. Sparta would have struggled with that idea: rest without merit. stillness without surveillance. Those concepts didn't fit, but they fit here, now. This is not a moment of insight. It doesn't need to be meaningful. Meaning wakes a mind. This is a moment of fading. Words become less important. Sentences flatten. Thoughts loosen their grip. The story no longer moves in a line. It drifts. Drifting is what the Spartan system tried to prevent, which makes drifting now feel like quiet rebellion. But there's no rebellion here, just rest. Everything that needed to be said has been said many times already. Nothing new is required. The past has been observed. The present is still. The future doesn't need preparation. Sparta prepared for everything, and still could not prepare for time. No one can. Time passes without instruction. It smooths edges. It dulls intensity. It makes even the strictest systems feel soft in retrospect. That's what has happened here. Sparta has softened into a story, then into a tone, now into background silence. And silence is not empty. It's full of rest. If you notice your breathing slow, that's fine. If thoughts thin out, even better. The story no longer asks to be followed. You can let it go completely. There is no final image to hold on to, no final idea to grasp, just the sense that something once rigid has finally relaxed. That's enough. Nothing else needs to happen. The night will take it from here.
All right. This is where the story barely exists at all. Not ending, just thinning out. By now, Sparta is no longer something you're thinking about. It's something that passed through and left no pressure behind, like a sound you only notice after it's gone. That's usually the final stage of attention, when the mind stops holding shape entirely. Sparta spent centuries trying to prevent this exact thing, the loss of shape, the blurring of edges, the softening of identity. Everything about the Spartan system was designed to resist fading. Clear roles, clear rules, clear expectations. Nothing ambiguous, nothing flexible. Flexibility was seen as weakness. Weakness was dangerous. So the system stayed firm, and firm things don't like to dissolve. But dissolution doesn't ask permission. It happens quietly. Sparta dissolved not because it failed its rules, but because it followed them too well for too long. Rigid systems don't adapt, they endure, and endurance without renewal slowly becomes inertia. Inertia feels stable until movement is required. Then it becomes a problem. Sparta reached a point where movement was no longer possible, not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked options. Options require imagination. Imagination requires freedom. Sparta never practiced freedom. It practiced control. Control works best when conditions stay the same. Conditions never do. So time did what time always does. It outlasted certainty. That's not dramatic, it's gentle. Gentleness is hard to respect when you're awake, but it makes perfect sense at night. At night, force feels unnecessary. Sharpness feels intrusive. Softness feels correct, which is why this story has softened so much. It's no longer trying to hold your attention. It's letting it drift. Sparta once demanded constant awareness, constant readiness. The opposite is happening now. Awareness is dimming. Readiness is irrelevant. Nothing is coming. That idea alone is restful. The Spartans lived as if something was always coming, an enemy, a test, a judgment. That expectation shaped everything. Imagine living without it. No evaluation, no comparison, no standard to meet, just existing. That would have felt dangerous to a Spartan. To us, it feels like rest. This difference matters. It shows how systems shape would feel safe. Sparta trained people to feel safe only under pressure. Without pressure, they felt exposed. Tonight, there is no pressure at all, and that's okay. You don't need to prepare for anything. You don't need to remember anything. The story has already done enough. At this point, even reflection feels unnecessary. Reflection creates movement in the mind. Movement can wait. Everything important about Sparta has already faded into the background. The warriors are gone. The routines are gone. The fear is gone. Only quiet remains. And quiet doesn't need structure. Sparta needed structure to exist. Quiet exists on its own. That's why quiet always wins eventually. No system outlasts silence. Silence absorbs everything. It absorbs rules, it absorbs myths, it even absorbs the need to understand. This is where the story dissolves completely. Not into meaning, not into insight, into nothing in particular, which is exactly where sleep likes to arrive. If thoughts appear, let them pass. If none appear, even better. Nothing here needs attention. Sparta once demanded attention constantly. It demanded vigilance. Now it demands nothing. The contrast is complete. There is no final image to hold, no closing thought to repeat, just the sense that effort is no longer required, that you don't need to endure anything, that the long discipline of listening is finished. You can stop holding the thread now. The night will keep going without you. That's not loss, that's relief. Everything eventually becomes quiet enough to let go, even Sparta. And now, even this story. All right. This is the part where even the idea of part 16 feels unnecessary. Not because anything is missing, but because nothing is being held anymore. The story is no longer unfolding, it's settling, like dust after movement has stopped. Sparta, by now, has no edges at all, no shape, no demand, just a faint sense that something once existed very intensely and now doesn't need to. That's usually how endurance ends, not with collapse, but with release. Sparta trained people to carry weight constantly, physical weight, social weight, expectation. Even when standing still, they were carrying something: preparedness, reputation, the pressure of being watched. There was never a moment when the weight was set down. That kind of life produces strength and fatigue, always both. Fatigue doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as quiet letting go. Sparta did not choose to let go. It simply reached a point where holding on required more energy than existed. That's not failure. It's biology. Bodies have limits. So do cultures. The Spartan system assumed limits could be trained away, conditioned out, ignored. For a long time, that seemed true. But limits don't disappear. They wait. And waiting is something time is very good at. Time didn't confront Sparta. It didn't challenge it. It just kept moving. Movement exposes rigidity. Flexible things move with time. Rigid things resist it. Resistance looks strong until it doesn't. Sparta resisted beautifully, consistently, for generations, and then it quietly stopped mattering. Not because it was defeated, but because the world found other ways to organize itself, ways that allowed variation, negotiation, change. Those ways are messier, less clean, less admirable from a distance, but they survive longer. Sparta valued purity, Purity simplifies. It also narrows. The narrower a system becomes, the less room it has to breathe. Eventually, breathing feels strained. That's where Sparta ended. Breathing became effort, and effort without purpose feels pointless. At this stage of the story, even that analysis feels heavy, so it can drift away too. There's nothing left to solve, nothing left to examine. The mind doesn't need stimulation anymore. It needs space. Space is what Sparta never allowed. Everything had a place. Everything was assigned. Even silence was regulated. But real silence can't be regulated. It just arrives. Like now. This is not the silence of discipline, not the silence of control. This is the silence of absence. Absence of expectation, absence of evaluation, absence of urgency. Urgency is what keeps thoughts sharp. Without urgency, thoughts soften. They wander, they blur, they fade. This is where history becomes background texture. You might not even be picturing Sparta anymore. That's fine. The story doesn't need images to continue. It doesn't even need words. The rhythm is enough. Sparta once relied on rhythm too. Marching rhythms, training rhythms, daily repetition. Those rhythms enforced sameness. This rhythm does the opposite. It dissolves. It allows unevenness, pauses, gaps. Gaps are restful. Gaps let the mind stop holding on. Sparta never trusted gaps. Unstructured time was dangerous. Here, unstructured time is the goal. Nothing will be lost if attention drifts. Nothing important depends on vigilance. There is no enemy approaching, no test coming. That idea alone is calming. The Spartans lived as if relevance had to be constantly proven, as if value expired without reinforcement. That belief fueled discipline. It also fueled anxiety. Anxiety keeps systems alive until it exhausts them. Sparta lived on anxiety longer than most, and then it didn't. Now it exists only as a story that has grown very tired, a story that no longer insists on being followed. It's okay if sentences blur together, if meaning slips. Meaning is not required here. This is not education anymore. It's atmosphere. The past has done its part. It passed by slowly. Now it rests. You can rest too. There is nothing left to carry forward, no lesson to apply, no identity to adopt. Sparta demanded identity. Tonight demands nothing. That difference is profound. It shows how heavy certainty can be, and how light uncertainty feels when it's no longer threatening. Uncertainty here is not danger, it's openness. Open space, open time. Nothing needs to happen next. The story does not need to close formally. Formality creates structure. Structure wakes the mind. This part avoids structure. It just lingers until there's nothing left to linger on. If you notice yourself forgetting where you are in the story, that's exactly where you should be. The narrative thread has loosened enough to let go. Sparta would have seen this as failure, loss of discipline, loss of form. But rest does not need discipline. It needs permission. You have it. Nothing is being measured. Nothing is being compared. There is no ideal state to reach. Just this. Stillness without effort. Sparta never practiced this, which makes it quietly fitting that its story now leads here. From extreme control to complete release. From constant readiness to nothing at all. This is not an ending. It's a quiet disappearance. And disappearances don't need acknowledgement. They just happen. Like sleep. If it hasn't arrived yet, it will. Not because you've earned it, not because you've endured long enough, but because nothing is holding it back. The story has finally stepped out of the way. There is nothing left to follow. Only rest.
All right.
This is where the words are almost unnecessary. Not because they're wrong, but because they're no longer needed. By now, the story isn't a story anymore. It's a faint presence, something that drifted through and didn't leave instructions behind. Sparta is no longer an image. No hills, no shields, no routines. Just a distant sense of firmness that has finally relaxed. That's usually the final stage of any long reflection, when the subject dissolves and the mind keeps floating anyway. Sparta spent its existence refusing to float. It anchored everything down: rules, bodies, thoughts. Anchors feel safe in rough water, but they don't move. Eventually, the water changes. Sparta didn't, so the water passed it by. At this point, even analysis feels too sharp, so it can soften too. There's no need to think about decline or legacy anymore. Those are waking concepts. Night prefers neutrality. Neutrality is where effort stops. Sparta never aimed for neutral. It aimed for absolute. Absolute clarity, absolute obedience, absolute readiness. Absolute states are exhausting. The human body can maintain them only temporarily. Even centuries are temporary. Time is very patient, and patience always outlasts intensity. Sparta burned steadily for a long time, then it dimmed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It just stopped demanding fuel. And now, this story is doing the same. The narration is no longer carrying information forward. It's slowing down enough that thoughts slip through. That's not a mistake. It's the point. You don't need to remember what part this is. You don't need to remember what came before. Memory is optional now. Sparta required memory. Tradition depended on remembering precisely. Forgetting was dangerous. Here, forgetting is gentle. Nothing breaks if you forget. Nothing collapses. The mind loosens because it's allowed to. This is what happens when structure releases its grip. No alarms, no consequences, just space opening quietly. You might notice gaps between thoughts getting longer, or thoughts turning abstract, or not forming at all. That's fine. There's nothing here that requires tracking. The story no longer moves in time. It just exists. Sparta once believed existence had to be justified through usefulness, through contribution, through endurance. Here, existence doesn't need justification. You don't need to contribute anything. You don't need to endure. You're already doing enough by doing nothing. That idea would have felt strange in Sparta, suspicious. Stillness without purpose was not allowed. Tonight, it is. The contrast is complete. The most rigid system imaginable has dissolved into permission. Permission to drift. Permission to stop holding on. This part doesn't need to resolve anything. Resolution creates edges. Edges keep the mind alert. Softness lets it sink. So sentences flatten, pacing slows. Words become background texture rather than content. If you're still awake, that's okay. If you're not, even better. The story isn't watching. Sparta watched constantly, evaluated constantly. This story does not. Nothing is being measured. Nothing is being compared. There is no ideal listener state. Just whatever state you're in. That's enough. The night doesn't ask for improvement. It doesn't ask for discipline. It just arrives and holds things quietly, which is something Sparta never learned how to do. Hold without controlling, maintain without pressure. Pressure always leaks eventually, and now there is none. The words themselves are beginning to feel unnecessary, which means they're doing their job. The narrative thread has thinned to the point where it doesn't need to be followed. You can let it drop. Nothing bad happens when you do. No alarms sound,
No rules are broken. This is not the end of a lesson. It's the absence of one. Sparta demanded meaning. Tonight offers release. Release from expectation. Release from structure. Release from having to stay with the story. The story is already gone. Only the rhythm remains. And rhythm is soothing when it's slow enough. There is no reason to stay awake for what comes next. Nothing comes next. Just more quiet. Just rest. And that's enough.
All right. By now, even the idea of continuing feels optional, which is exactly where we're supposed to be. The story hasn't stopped. It's just become very light, like it's made mostly of pauses now, with a few words drifting through. Sparta, at this distance, doesn't feel like a civilization anymore. It feels like a posture, a way of holding the body too tightly for too long. Anyone who's ever stayed tense all day knows how that ends. Not with a dramatic snap, but with a slow ache that eventually convinces you to lie down. Cultures work the same way. Sparta lay down without announcing it, without permission, without ceremony. It simply ran out of reasons to stay upright. Earlier, Sparta believed constant pressure created strength, and for a while it did. But pressure never asks whether it's still needed. It just keeps pressing. Eventually, things give, sometimes quietly, sometimes gently. This was the quiet kind. At this point in the telling, even Sparta's sharp edges have rounded off. No more harsh rules, no more brutal routines, just the memory of intensity, softened by distance. That's what time does best. It blurs, it smooths, it turns firm outlines into vague shapes. You might notice the words are slowing again, spacing out, letting more silence slip between sentences. That's intentional. Silence is carrying most of the weight now. The words are just there to keep it company. Sparta would have hated this. Silence without purpose felt dangerous to them. But here, silence is safe. It doesn't demand readiness. It doesn't demand obedience. It simply exists. The mind responds to that instinctively. Breathing deepens, thoughts stretch out. There's no need to follow the logic anymore. No argument being made. The story isn't trying to convince you of anything. Sparta was always trying to convince itself that it was strong enough, pure enough, enduring enough. That kind of self-persuasion is exhausting. Eventually, even the most disciplined systems get tired of hearing their own slogans, and then they go quiet. This part lives in that quiet. Nothing is being built, nothing is being dismantled, just the gentle sense that effort has stopped. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're drifting, even better. The narration doesn't need an audience anymore. It's like listening to a distant voice through a wall. You don't catch every word, but the tone is calm enough that it doesn't matter. Sparta's tone was never calm. Even at rest, it was alert. That vigilance shaped generations, and then finally, it dissolved. Now, vigilance is unnecessary. No threats are approaching, no standards need maintaining. There's nothing to defend. That realization often comes right before sleep. The body recognizes safety faster than the mind does. And once it does, everything softens. The shoulders drop, the jaw loosens. Thoughts stop lining up so neatly. That's not failure. That's rest taking over. Sparta trained people to resist that feeling,
to overwrite it. Here, there's no resistance. The story isn't moving forward or backward anymore. It's just hovering. Hovering requires no effort. It's sustained by stillness. If you find yourself forgetting what this part was supposed to be about, that's perfect. It's about nothing now. Or rather, it's about letting go of needing it to be about something. Sparta always needed purpose. Here, purpose has quietly stepped out of the room. Nothing breaks when it does. The night holds everything gently. No alarms, no expectations, just time passing without pressure. The words will keep thinning, spacing out, until eventually they're barely noticeable at all. And that's okay. The story doesn't need to end. It just fades, like tension leaving the body, like breath slowing on its own. This is where we stay for a while, or don't. Either way, rest is already here.
All right. If you're still here, that's fine. If you're not, that's also fine. This part doesn't really distinguish between the two. By now, the story has become something closer to atmosphere than narrative. A low, steady presence, like the sound of wind outside a window you're not planning to open. Sparta, at this distance, isn't even a posture anymore. It's more like the memory of tension, that strange sensation you notice only after it's gone, when you realize your muscles aren't clenched anymore. For centuries, Sparta clenched everything: bodies, language, identity. Nothing was allowed to sag. Nothing was allowed to soften. And yet, here we are, in the softest possible version of its story. Time has a way of doing that. It doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it just keeps going until intensity gets tired of following. Spider never believed tiredness was real, or at least it treated it as something shameful, something to be overcome through habit and willpower. But tiredness is patient. It waits quietly. Eventually, it doesn't need permission anymore. The culture kept marching. The rituals continued. The words stayed the same, but the meaning slowly drained out. Meaning is heavier than we realize. When it leaves, things feel lighter. That's what's happening here. This part isn't adding anything. It's subtracting. Subtracting urgency. Subtracting focus. Subtracting the idea that something important is being said. Because nothing important needs to be said anymore. The night doesn't require insight. Sparta believed insight came only through struggle, through discomfort, through pressure. But insight also comes from release, from finally stopping. This is that moment stretched out. If you notice the pacing feels slower than before, that's because it is. Slowness creates space. Space allows drifting. Drifting is not laziness, it's recovery. Sparta never scheduled recovery. It assumed endurance replaced it. Endurance works for a while, then it quietly fails. And when it fails, what remains is softness. Softness was never celebrated in Sparta, but softness is what remains when everything else gives up. This story has given up now, not in a dramatic way, just in the way a conversation fades when both people are too comfortable to keep talking. There's no awkwardness here, no pressure to fill the silence. Silence has become the point. The words exist only to keep the silence from feeling abrupt. They're like dim lights in a hallway at night. You don't need them, but they make the transition gentler. Sparta's transitions were never gentle. Change came through force. This one doesn't. It just happens. You might notice your thoughts looping, returning to the same vague images, or dissolving altogether. That's normal. The mind, once it realizes nothing is being demanded of it, starts to rest on its own. You don't have to guide it. You don't have to follow the story. The story is barely here. Sparta once demanded full attention, constant vigilance. This is the opposite of that. There's no threat, no lesson, no expectation of memory. You won't be tested on any of this. The past can stay in the past. That realization often brings a deep sense of relief. History doesn't need us to hold it together. It already happened. Sparta already existed, already trained, already faded. Nothing you do now affects it. That's comforting. You're allowed to let it go completely. The voice continues, but it's not pulling you anywhere. It's just present. Presence without direction is rare. It feels strange at first. Then it feels safe. Safe enough for the body to slow down, for breathing to deepen, for awareness to soften around the edges. This is where stories usually end, not with conclusions, but with comfort. Sparta never offered comfort, only certainty. Certainty is rigid, comfort is flexible. Flexibility lasts longer. And now, flexibility has taken over. There's nothing left to say about training, about discipline, about lifestyle. Those details have already dissolved. All that remains is the feeling of something once intense, now completely still. Stillness doesn't need explanation. It just exists. If sleep hasn't arrived yet, it will. There's nothing blocking it. No unresolved tension, no unanswered questions. Just a quiet stretch of time where nothing matters very much. This part doesn't need to close formally. It can simply taper off. The words will keep thinning. The pauses will grow longer, until eventually there's nothing left to notice at all. And that's fine. The story doesn't mind. All right. This part exists mostly because numbers do, not because the story needs it, not because anything is unfinished, just because we're still here and the night is still wide. By now, Sparta isn't even fading anymore. It has already faded. What remains is the idea that something once mattered very intensely and now doesn't ask to be remembered correctly. That's a comfortable place for a story to land. Sparta was never comfortable with that idea. Accuracy mattered. Repetition mattered. Doing things the same way forever mattered. Memory was a duty. Forgetting was weakness. But forgetting is also rest. And rest is what this part is about, even if it doesn't say so directly. Sparta trained people to remember rules automatically, to react without thinking, to move without hesitation. That kind of memory lives in the body. It's efficient. It's powerful. It's also tiring. Bodies eventually want to forget. They want to loosen patterns that no longer serve them. Cultures are bodies too, in a way. They develop habits. They cling to them. Sparta clung very hard until it couldn't. At this point in the story, we're no longer tracing events. No timelines, no institutions. Just a gentle sense of how things feel when the pressure finally lifts. Pressure shaped every Spartan day, from childhood onward. Even their meals were regulated, simple, sparse, functional. Nothing indulgent, nothing slow. Life was treated like a long preparation for something that never quite arrived. That kind of future-focused existence leaves very little room for now. This part lives entirely in now. There's no anticipation here, no build-up. Nothing is coming next. That realization can feel strange at first. The mind is used to leaning forward. but when there's nothing to lean toward, it eventually settles back. Sparta never leaned back. It stood rigidly upright. Posture was symbolic. Straight backs meant discipline. Relaxation looked like decay. But relaxation is not decay. It's maintenance. Without it, systems wear themselves down. That's what happened, and now the story has followed the same path. It worked hard at first. It carried detail. It held form. Then, gradually, it softened. Now it's barely holding shape at all. That's intentional. This part doesn't want your attention. It doesn't want engagement. It's fine if you drift in and out of hearing it. Sparta would have hated that. Inattention meant danger. Here, inattention means safety. You might notice your thoughts slipping away from history entirely, to nothing specific, to vague impressions. That's fine. The mind, when it's no longer tasked with processing information, starts doing what it does best, restoring itself. Sparta valued resilience over restoration. The idea was to endure until the end. But endurance without restoration only works temporarily. Eventually, everything that endures must rest. That includes stories. This one is resting now. You don't need to extract meaning from it. You don't need to hold on to facts. The facts already happened. They're stable without you. That's comforting, even if it's subtle. There's nothing you need to carry forward from Sparta, no lesson that must be applied. It existed, it trained, it persisted, and then it didn't. That arc is complete. The rest is just quiet. Quiet doesn't require explanation. If the sentences feel repetitive, that's not an accident. Repetition without urgency is soothing. Sparta used repetition to condition. This repetition does the opposite. It unwinds. The pace slows further. Words become less important than the space between them. That space is where the mind starts to let go. Let go of tracking. Let go of evaluating. Let go of needing to stay awake for the next idea. There is no next idea, just continuation without demand. This part could go on forever, and it still wouldn't be asking anything of you. That's rare. Most narratives want something: attention, emotion, conclusion. This one doesn't. It's content to exist quietly and then fade. Sparta was never content. Contentment requires trust. Trust that things don't need constant reinforcement. Sparta didn't trust that. But tonight, you can. Nothing will fall apart if you stop listening. Nothing will be missed. The story has already given everything it had. What remains is atmosphere, a low, even tone, like distant wind, like water far away. You don't focus on it. You let it pass through. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're not, even better. The words don't mind either way. They'll keep thinning, spacing out, until they barely register at all. This part doesn't end with a point. It just eases out of awareness. Sparta never eased. It pushed. This story does the opposite. It stops pushing. And that's enough. All right. This part exists mostly because numbers do, not because the story needs it, not because anything is unfinished, just because we're still here and the night is still wide. By now, Sparta isn't even fading anymore. It has already faded. What remains is the idea that something once mattered very intensely and now doesn't ask to be remembered correctly. That's a comfortable place for a story to land. Sparta was never comfortable with that idea. Accuracy mattered. Repetition mattered. Doing things the same way forever mattered. Memory was a duty. Forgetting was weakness. But forgetting is also rest. And rest is what this part is about, even if it doesn't say so directly. Sparta trained people to remember rules automatically, to react without thinking, to move without hesitation. That kind of memory lives in the body. It's efficient, it's powerful, it's also tiring. Bodies eventually want to forget. They want to loosen patterns that no longer serve them. Cultures are bodies too, in a way. They develop habits, they cling to them. Sparta clung very hard until it couldn't. At this point in the story, we're no longer tracing events. No timelines, no institutions, just a gentle sense of how things feel when the pressure finally lifts. Pressure shaped every Spartan day, from childhood onward. Even their meals were regulated, simple, sparse, functional. Nothing indulgent, nothing slow. Life was treated like a long preparation for something that never quite arrived. That kind of future-focused existence leaves very little room for now. This part lives entirely in now. There's no anticipation here, no build-up. Nothing is coming next. That realization can feel strange at first. The mind is used to leaning forward, but when there's nothing to lean toward, it eventually settles back. Sparta never leaned back. It stood rigidly upright. Posture was symbolic. Straight backs meant discipline. Relaxation looked like decay. But relaxation is not decay. It's maintenance. Without it, systems wear themselves down. That's what happened. And now the story has followed the same path. It worked hard at first. It carried detail. It held form. Then, gradually, it softened. Now it's barely holding shape at all. That's intentional. This part doesn't want your attention. It doesn't want engagement. It's fine if you drift in and out of hearing it. Sparta would have hated that. Inattention meant danger. Here, inattention means safety. You might notice your thoughts slipping away from history entirely, to nothing specific, to vague impressions. That's fine. The mind, when it's no longer tasked with processing information, starts doing what it does best, restoring itself. Sparta valued resilience over restoration. The idea was to endure until the end. But endurance without restoration only works temporarily. Eventually, everything that endures must rest. That includes stories. This one is resting now. You don't need to extract meaning from it. You don't need to hold on to facts. The facts already happened. They're stable without you. That's comforting, even if it's subtle. There's nothing you need to carry forward from Sparta, no lesson that must be applied. It existed, it trained, it persisted, and then it didn't. That arc is complete. The rest is just quiet. Quiet doesn't require explanation. If the sentences feel repetitive, that's not an accident. Repetition without urgency is soothing. Sparta used repetition to condition. This repetition does the opposite. It unwinds. The pace slows further. Words become less important than the space between them. That space is where the mind starts to let go. Let go of tracking. Let go of evaluating. Let go of needing to stay awake for the next idea. There is no next idea, just continuation without demand. This part could go on forever, and it still wouldn't be asking anything of you. That's rare. Most narratives want something: attention, emotion, conclusion. This one doesn't. It's content to exist quietly and then fade. Sparta was never content. Contentment requires trust. Trust that things don't need constant reinforcement. Sparta didn't trust that. But tonight, you can. Nothing will fall apart if you stop listening. Nothing will be missed. The story has already given everything it had. What remains is atmosphere, a low, even tone, like distant wind, like water far away.
You don't focus on it. You let it pass through. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're not, even better. The words don't mind either way. They'll keep thinning, spacing out, until they barely register at all. This part doesn't end with a point. It just eases out of awareness. Sparta never eased. It pushed. This story does the opposite. It stops pushing. And that's enough.
All right. This is the last one. Not because anything dramatic is happening, not because the story demands closure, just because eventually even continuing stops making sense. By now, the idea of Sparta has almost completely dissolved, not erased, just no longer sharp enough to hold attention. It's like trying to remember a dream from earlier in the night. You know what mattered at the time, you know there were shapes, maybe voices, but they don't assemble anymore. That's fine. Sparta spent its entire existence trying to prevent that kind of fading, through ritual, through repetition, through discipline so strict it bordered on obsession. Memory was survival. Tradition was identity. But time doesn't care how carefully something is preserved. It softens everything eventually. Even the hardest systems, even the most disciplined people, even Sparta. What's left now isn't history, it's residue. A feeling more than a narrative. A sense of weight that has finally been set down. Sparta never set weight down willingly. Everything was a test, every moment an opportunity to prove endurance. Even rest was framed as preparation. That constant framing is exhausting. This final part doesn't frame anything. It doesn't introduce, it doesn't conclude. It just exists long enough to let go. If you notice your thoughts drifting away from the words entirely, that's exactly right. The story has already stepped aside. There's nothing here that requires attention. Sparta demanded attention constantly. Awareness was survival. Here, awareness can dim. Nothing bad happens when it does. The mind begins to treat the narration like ambient sound, something present but unimportant. That's when rest really starts. You don't need to follow sentences. You don't need to remember themes. The themes already did their work. Sparta trained bodies to be ready at all times, but bodies aren't meant to be ready forever. They're meant to recover. Cultures forget that. Stories don't have to. This story learned how to stop pushing, and now it's letting you do the same. There is no final insight waiting, no summary that ties everything together. Life doesn't work that way. Neither does history. Things happen, they persist, they fade. That's enough. If you think back to the beginning of all this, Sparta was sharp, defined, rigid. Now it's barely present at all. That arc mirrors what happens inside the mind as it relaxes. Focus tightens, then loosens, then dissolves. Nothing is lost in that process. Restoration isn't loss. Sparta feared softness because it confused it with weakness. But softness is how systems survive change. Sparta refused to change, so softness arrived anyway, just later and without permission. This final stretch doesn't need pacing. It doesn't need rhythm. Even rhythm can fade now. The pauses can stretch. The silence can carry more than the words. If sleep has already arrived, this part will pass unnoticed. If it hasn't, there's no rush. Nothing is coming next that you need to be awake for. The night is not keeping score. History is not watching. Sparta is not judging. There's a strange comfort in realizing that even the most demanding cultures eventually stop demanding anything at all.
They become quiet stories, then vague memories, then atmosphere, and finally, nothing. This is that final nothing. Not empty, just unburdened. You don't need to stay with the voice. You don't need to wait for a final sentence. The end doesn't need to announce itself. It can simply stop. Like a breath slowing, like muscles releasing, like awareness drifting off without needing permission. That's how this ends. Not with certainty, not with strength, but with rest.